What's up guys, Smalls here of 9 to 5 Mac, and if you're a fan of good ideas, consider subscribing to the channel for future content like this. The new MacBook Pros are here, and I've got an M1 Max model on order, but I think it's arguably a lot more important to see how this base level MacBook Pro performs, generally speaking. So if you spend the least amount of money you can on one of these new MacBook Pros, what's the experience going to be like? Before we get into performance and all that good stuff, we gotta go over what makes these laptops different in general, because these laptops have been completely redesigned, and I gotta say, these MacBook Pros truly blend elements of old and new in a way that's nearly perfect, if you ask me. When looking at this device in clamshell mode, you almost forget that this is a 2021 device. The overall shape and ergonomics of this laptop is very reminiscent of the MacBook Pro models from the mid-2000s, and I freaking love the changes. They moved the MacBook Pro text logo from the bottom bezel to the bottom of the computer engraved into the chassis, and we've got these larger circular rubber feet on the bottom. You've no longer got the sharpest tapered edges, and everything just feels a little rounder. They've also eliminated the touch bar from the previous models and given the keyboard a blacked out design. And when I first saw this, I thought this was because the keyboard well was its own component and potentially replaceable, but I watched the iFixit teardown of this computer and that's not really the case at all. And it appears that this indented area in the chassis is still physically a part of the main chassis, it's just painted black. The keyboard is generally speaking the same as far as the feel, but that's not a problem since they fixed the keyboards in the MacBook Pros in the past few years. They did change the design of the Touch ID button though. It's now been changed to look exactly like the new Touch ID keyboards Apple released with the M1 iMac and then released in standalone form a few months ago. And there have been a lot of people who said that Face ID should have been on these MacBook Pros, especially since there's the notch, which I'll get into in a second, but I overall think that Touch ID works very well. I've never had any real problems with it. It just works. It's really simple. And then the weight. This thing is hefty. It's about a ½ pound heavier than the 13-inch Intel Pro, and you really feel that weight. Now granted, I'm coming from an M1 MacBook Air as my daily laptop to this, but even still, this is not a super light laptop, and I'm honestly absolutely fine with that. Everything here hardware-wise serves a purpose, and although you can feel the weight, it's an incredibly premium feeling device, as you'd expect for the price it's commanding. And there's nothing worse than a laptop that feels bulky and cheap. Luckily, this MacBook Pro doesn't have that problem. Overall, I think Apple kind of nailed the exterior of these MacBook Pros. Like I said, it's a perfect blend of old and new, and with all these somewhat small changes combined, Apple's created a very classy looking machine. When you see this thing and open it up, you not only know that it's an expensive piece of hardware, but that it means business on a performance end as well, which we'll get into later. The ports on the MacBook Pro are once again multifaceted. We've got more than just Thunderbolt ports and a headphone jack. We've got MagSafe, the magnetic connector from the pre-2016 MacBooks, an HDMI 2.0 port, and a UHS 2 enabled SD card slot. MagSafe was always one of the most iconic and functional aspects of the MacBook Pros, and even though I've spent like the last 3 or 4 years learning to live without it, I am beyond ecstatic that it has returned, and it works just as well as it did on the MacBooks of the past. In fact, I think it's a little bit stronger. And the best part about MagSafe returning is that it's optional now. All 3 Thunderbolt ports on these MacBooks are capable of fully charging the MacBook Pro as well. So if you don't want to use your MagSafe cable or you damage your MagSafe cable, you'll still be able to charge your MacBooks with no problem. And speaking of damage, I filmed this clip yesterday just testing how MagSafe functionally keeps your laptop safe if you snag your cable, and I tried to charge my MacBook Pro via MagSafe after that and haven't gotten it to charge or respond in any way since. I think my little test broke that cable, so yeah, that's cool. The HDMI port has been something I've been a little indifferent on, and that's because from a functionality standpoint, it isn't really bringing anything to the table that the Thunderbolt 4 ports aren't. I fully understand that Apple brought this port back to please the general professional crowd and eliminate need for dongles when you're, let's say, presenting your spreadsheets on the projector in the office and whatnot. I fully understand that, but they could have really catered to visual design pros and videographers who are working with 6K, 8K, and high refresh rate 4K displays by throwing in an HDMI 2.1 port. HDMI 2.0, which this laptop has, only supports up to 4K at 60Hz displays. HDMI 2.1 has support for 4K at 120Hz displays and 8K displays as well. And especially considering the price point of these machines, I think Apple definitely could have swung an HDMI 2.1 port in here, but this is not really a deal breaker, and Apple always has the opportunity and ability to put HDMI 2.1 in a refresh model next year or later on. The SD card slot is UHS 2 enabled, which essentially means it supports those SD card slots with higher write speeds that you may be putting in your mirrorless camera or cinema camera. So this port can reach those triple-digit read and write speeds for transferring or viewing files on an SD card. The speed aspect of it is something that's only going to be truly appreciated by professionals who need the best speeds they can get. But to everyone else, this is just the return of a convenient port that was taken away pretty unnecessarily. And so hopefully Apple doesn't do this again until the SD card slot in and of itself becomes obsolete. Now honestly, the return of MagSafe, the card slot, and HDMI are cool, but I think what they've done with the Thunderbolt ports is the coolest aspect of the ports on these new MacBook Pros. Firstly, these are Thunderbolt 4 ports, as opposed to USB 4 and Thunderbolt 3 that are on the other and previous Mac models. Thunderbolt 4 isn't necessarily a performance leap over Thunderbolt 3, but because of stricter certification requirements by the creators of Thunderbolt, there are now better universal standards for what Thunderbolt can and can't do. Thunderbolt 3 is only supposed to support one 4K display at minimum, but there are Thunderbolt 3 devices that can support two 4K displays or even an 8K display, while Thunderbolt 4 certification requires support for at least two 4K displays, which is much better. In summary, Thunderbolt 4 gets rid of the power tiers within Thunderbolt. There's no longer going to be different iterations of the same Thunderbolt version that perform differently than each other. The best part about the Thunderbolt implementation here is that each Thunderbolt port has its own controller as well, which means you don't have to worry about bandwidth being split up by two Thunderbolt ports at once. Each port will give you the maximum amount of performance possible through Thunderbolt, which is 40 gigabits per second. And that's why you can hook up 3 high-resolution monitors to this thing at once, or 4 with an M1 Max spec. And this is seriously a game changer for anyone who hooks up a lot of high-end peripherals or displays at once to their laptop. And then the headphone jack. Firstly, they moved the headphone jack back to the left side of the laptop, which is the way they had the MacBooks before 2016. And not only that, but the jack has been upgraded to support high impedance headphones, which essentially means headphones like this pair of Beyerdynamic DT990s that normally require a headphone amplifier to run correctly can now just be plugged straight into the laptop. If you were to plug in these headphones straight into most other laptops, it'd sound like the maximum volume is at half volume. And that's because most laptops don't have the headphone jack that can drive headphones like this. And while the quality you get through the headphone jack isn't amazing in and of itself, I must applaud Apple for looking out for all the musicians and audio engineers by doing this with that headphone jack. Outside of my HDMI 2.0 complaint, I think Apple nailed the I/O here with these new Pros. I don't think many professionals will have much to complain about with the layout here, and I think that means Apple succeeded on that front. If you want to talk about the best displays on a laptop, we can talk about this new MacBook Pro here. There are just so many things to love about the display from an amateur to a professional standpoint, but let's get this notch situation out of the way. Apple has really gotten under people's skin by throwing a notch on this display. It was something people had a lot to say about when they did on the iPhone, and I think generally it's a lot more shocking to see on a MacBook since nobody else has really done this before on a laptop. You can see that the notch ends vertically right at the edge of the menu bar on top, so it's not actually taking up space that you'd be using with an app window or something like that. Unfortunately though, Apple so far hasn't really thought about items on the menu bar that may be masked by the notch. Quinn from Snazzy Labs actually highlighted this on Twitter. He was one of the first to do so.
With the notch in the way now, what happens if your app menus go too far to the right or your status menus go too far to the left? Do they get smaller, or do they jump to the other side, or are they scrollable? The answer is freaking nothing. If I turn on iStat menus, look at that. There is stuff behind the menu bar that I can't see.
So yeah, Apple treats the notch from a UI perspective as if it isn't there. You move the mouse over the notch and your cursor disappears, but from an everyday usability standpoint, none of this really matters that much unless you've got a million menu bar items. I think that people are mostly just tripping about the way it looks. It's not aesthetically pleasing and whatnot, and yes, I don't like the way it looks, but outside of potentially blocking menu bar items, it's not actually taking up any extra space or giving you any less screen real estate than what you would have had on prior models. panels. These laptops do not have a 16:9 aspect ratio display and never have, so when you're watching full screen videos, that black bar at the top and bottom is always going to be there, notch or no notch. So my advice is, if the notch has gotten your blood boiling, grow up, you'll get over it. And for the record, if this display was trash outside of the notch, I'd probably be a lot more critical of it, but with everything else these displays offer, I just can't see why people would consider this notch a deal breaker, like I've seen some people say. When getting to the actual display tech on this MacBook Pro, everything here is pretty much perfect for most users. I don't really like throwing that word around very often, but from an engineering standpoint, these displays are marvelous. We got a taste of this with the 12.9-inch iPad Pro that came out earlier this year that featured a Super Retina XDR display, and that's what we've got here. So this is now a mini LED backlit panel that's going to provide better contrast, dynamic range, and brightness than we've ever gotten on a MacBook display. And as some of you may have noticed, HDR is a big thing for us here on the channel. It's the future, and mini LED technology is what allows for that. It's what allows for those crazy high brightness figures like we've got here. This MacBook Pro has 1000 nits of sustained peak brightness and up to 1600 nits of peak brightness for HDR content. And that's insanely bright compared to the 500 nits of max brightness on the previous models. And you know what? Let's crank up the brightness so you can really see what I mean. If you're on an HDR device, or specifically a 14 or 16-inch M1 MacBook Pro, it's about to get real bright. Ready? All right, here we go. Yeah, so the fact that Apple was able to fit a display capable of that in this super thin chassis is honestly incredible. And that's on top of the fact that this is not only a 3.5K resolution display, but capable of a 120Hz refresh rate. This display has Apple's ProMotion technology that was first introduced on the iPad Pro, then made its way to the latest iPhone Pro models earlier this fall. Now we've got it on the MacBook Pro, and it's absolutely the cherry on top. Some people have said that it's not very noticeable, but I notice it every time I navigate the general UI. Just moving the cursor around or scrolling through folders in the menu or the launch pad, I can see that enhanced smoothness, and it only makes the already fantastic display so much better. When you combine the high resolution, crazy high brightness figures, the smoothness and efficiency of ProMotion, and the wide color gamut support, the best way to describe the display in one word is hard. The displays on these Pros are going to make every other display on competing laptops seem pretty lackluster in comparison, with a few exceptions. It's that good, and you can bet your bottom dollar that if you damage this display and you don't have AppleCare coverage, it's gonna hurt real bad. The new 1080p webcam on the MacBook Pro isn't amazing by any means, but it's a huge step up from the embarrassment of a webcam that shipped with the MacBook Pros for years. It's more or less on par with the new 24-inch M1 iMac now as far as quality, and that's nothing to complain about. But man, the speakers on this thing. The speakers on the MacBook Pro have always been good, if not the best out there on a laptop, but Apple decided to just widen the gap even further and throw in a new 6-speaker sound system with force-canceling woofers that you can actually feel when cranking a bassy track all the way up. These speakers also have support for Dolby Atmos and spatial audio, which is aiming to give a surround sound feel. And generally speaking, these speakers sound fantastic. They're hands down the best I've heard on a laptop thus far. Really solid low-end presence and clarity is something that a lot of high-end laptop speakers struggle with, but that isn't the case here at all. And for being in a chassis this thin and prohibitive, I'm really struggling to find any reasonable complaints with the way these speakers sound. And still not touching like the iMac in terms of speaker quality, but there are very few other laptops that come close to the MacBook Pro in terms of the way the speakers sound. Another component in these MacBooks that truly surprised me is the microphone. This thing is seriously impressive, and I was honestly shocked with how it sounded after doing my first recording tests. I had to airdrop my voice recording to a few other devices just to make sure that what I was hearing was really that good, and it is. This is the first laptop microphone I've heard that I feel as though I could truly rely on if I needed to do some voiceover work and couldn't get access to proper recording equipment. And guess what? If you couldn't tell already, I've been recording on this microphone for the entire time I've been talking about it. If you're in a quiet environment, you should have no complaints with the way this MacBook Pro's microphone sounds. I've been really satisfied with it. Now let's get into performance. So what should you expect from the M1 Pro with an 8-core CPU, 14-core GPU, and 16 gigs of RAM in terms of performance? Well, of course, performance is substantially improved over M1, but the first thing that I noticed is that through all of my testing, I never got a single low memory notification, which is something I frequently got on my M1 Mac Mini, and especially my 8GB M1 MacBook Air when pushing them to the absolute limits. Even though this has just as much RAM as my M1 Mini, M1 Pro seems to be managing it better than M1 does, which is nice to see. I'll also say that once again, throughout all of my testing, this computer has been dead silent to use as well. When doing a bunch of high-resolution video exports back to back, not once did I ever hear the fans kick up. And given the pretty substantially sized fans inside of these machines, I find it surprising that you almost never hear them. Either the fans are just never really running, or they're just super low volume. Either way, these are not noisy machines. Perhaps there are scenarios where the fans are audible, but I've done nothing thus far that's brought the Pro to that point. When running your typical Geekbench CPU and metal tests, you can clearly see that there's a major jump in CPU, but especially GPU performance, and that's definitely where M1 is lacking the most in terms of performance. And so I've been very anxious to see what Apple's dedicated Mac GPU would perform like, especially for things like editing and exporting 8K video, which we've been aiming to upload consistently on this channel. M1 can handle 8K video editing, but not on a large scale, and unfortunately, that's still the case here with an 8-core M1 Pro to an extent. I'd say that export speeds compared to M1 have vastly improved for 6K and 8K video, but the general playback within editing software is still a little rough depending on the codec you're working with. Most mirrorless cameras with 8K capability record in H.265, which is a high quality but very compressed codec, and so far there doesn't seem to be any vast difference for support for H.265 encoding and decoding. I ran a bunch of export tests with different footage from different cameras, but the bulk of my 8K export testing was done with my camera, the Canon R5, which shoots 8K in either RAW or H.265. And while the playback in full quality isn't very usable if you ask me, the actual export times have been drastically improved compared to M1. And the export times are definitely a lot more feasible, but it depends on how heavy your edits are. If you've got limitless text effects and transitions in your 8K projects, it'll be pretty rough, but if not, it seems like you can normally export projects in around double the time of the length of the project itself. But if you're working with ProRes video, you're gonna see a massive improvement in overall playback and export speed. M1 Pro and M1 Max have dedicated encoders and decoders for ProRes video, and Apple says you can play back multiple streams of 4K and 8K video simultaneously while using very little power, and that's definitely true for 4K video. It can handle 4K ProRes RAW like a champ, and I hope that's the case for 8K ProRes as well, but unfortunately I haven't been able to get my hands on any 8K ProRes footage to test out. I don't currently have a Ninja 5 Plus recorder, which will allow me to shoot 8K ProRes footage from my camera, and I can't really find anything online. I could technically create 8K ProRes files, but I'd rather just test raw footage straight out of a camera or a recorder. So if you happen to have access to raw 8K ProRes footage or know someone who does, let me know in the comment section down below, because I'd love to test that out and share the results. And unfortunately, I haven't had time to run these exact tests on my M1 Mac Mini to directly compare, but I have a bunch of export tests I did in Final Cut, testing various high-resolution video clips and timing the exports. For this being the $2,000 base model, I'm not exactly blown away by the overall performance for video editing and higher end footage, at least coming from M1. But the key thing to remember here is that during all of these exports and tests, the machines maintained very good battery life when running on battery power, and although it's gotten a little warm after running tests back to back, the machine's been dead silent, and I mean dead silent, just like my M1 Mac Mini and M1 iMac. The machine doesn't make a sound when you're pushing it very hard, and you'd be very hard pressed to find anything like that in a Windows device, especially at the $2,000 price point. And that's a part of what makes this computer, from a performance standpoint, an incredible value despite the high price tag. So, quick update. I don't know if you can hear that, but I'm editing the review right now in 8K HDR, and the fans are definitely going off. I don't know if that's very audible, but we finally got the fans to kick in. So this is not a completely silent machine all the time. If you do push it to the limits, it will come on. But I mean, I still don't think this is a deal breaker in any way, because most laptops fans would come on when doing half the workload of this machine. I'm focusing heavily on Final Cut Pro performance, not only because that's the primary program that Apple optimizes these machines for, but it's because that's a program I use every day for various different projects, including making these videos. But compared to M1, these MacBooks are going to give an improvement for productivity apps across the board, like Xcode, Cinema 4D, Logic, Photoshop, and DaVinci Resolve. But for everything that doesn't require much GPU power, the gap in performance between this base M1 Pro and M1 isn't light years apart. But that's not to say performance is bad, because it's quite the opposite, and generally speaking, I'd say M1 Pro handles all professional workloads pretty well. I also want to talk about the performance of the SSDs in these new Pros. The 512GB M1 Pro is pushing around 5,400 megabytes read and 4,200 megabytes per second write speeds, which is close to double the speeds we've had on previous Mac models. For transferring massive video files, music files, and things like that, this SSD is going to be one of the best options out there, and especially for that $2,000 price point. I used to think that my Thunderbolt 3 SSDs that I use as scratch disks for editing videos were blazing fast, but these SSDs in here put those to shame. Now, in my opinion, the battery life on these MacBook Pros are one of its weaker aspects. It isn't phenomenal as I'd hoped it would be, but it still blows away any of the Intel MacBooks out of the water, and blows most Windows laptops at this price point out of the water. I did a lot of intensive work on this machine while running purely on battery power, and you can tell that you're simply not going to be able to push this thing all day, every day, without getting at least one charge in. But if you're especially using the Pro for web browsing and typing out documents, this is easily an all-day laptop, just like the standard M1 Max. And the battery life is even more impressive when you consider the fact that you've got this 3.5K mini LED ProMotion display that can get very, very bright. And I'm really curious to see how well the battery life holds up in the long term, but for now, the battery life overall is pretty good, and Apple's advertised battery life figures are pretty much close to spot on. The new MacBook Pro with M1 Pro for $2,000 is a pretty interesting purchase, because while you're getting all of the benefits of this new MacBook hardware, the 8-core M1 Pro SoC is the weakest example of these new models, and in my testing, not necessarily leagues above M1 for most things. But don't get me wrong, these machines are incredibly fast for most Pro things. I just don't think that the performance alone widens the gap between this and the 13-inch M1 Pro. But when you combine this best-in-class performance with the fantastic display and speakers, all-day battery life, premium design, and top-notch connectivity, you've got a device that checks pretty much every box for the price it commands. When using this device, you can tell that Apple truly cared about delivering a product that can at the very least deliver in every aspect. Outside of the cost itself, there isn't any major deal breaker with these machines that I'd tell you to be wary of. And so the 14-inch M1 model is going to be my daily driver until we get a new Pro-level desktop from Apple running their silicon. The experience I've had using this laptop has been fantastic, and I can't recommend it enough for someone looking for the most well-rounded Pro laptop. But that pretty much does it for this review. What do you guys think about these new MacBook Pros? Like I said, I'm gonna get myself an M1 Max model. I've already got it on order. That should be pretty much the sweet spot for me as far as performance, and hopefully we can be putting out 8K HDR videos on this channel going forward thanks to that. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for future content like this. Thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.